you to the third session of day 2 of the international webinar on Assamese literature in translation, theory, and practice. On the behalf of the Department of Modern Indian Languages, I extend my heartfelt thanks to all of you, to all the faculty members, research scholars, students, participants, and speakers for being here with us today. Day 1 proved to be a splendid success, and your active participation and deep engagement merit special mention here. So thank you and welcome. My name is Manvi Choudhury, and I'm pursuing my PhD from the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies, University of Delhi, and I will be moderating this session. So once again, thank you and welcome to the webinar. Now, before we get started, there are just a few points that I want you to be familiar with. So the speakers will be given 20 minutes for the paper presentation, and this will be followed by 10 minutes of discussion. And we kindly request the speakers to adhere to the time limit. As for the audience is requested to drop their concerns, their observations, feedback, and questions in the chat box. I will definitely take them up right after the presentation. You're also requested to mute yourselves throughout the session. So now, without further delay, with great pleasure, I would like to introduce to you the first speaker for the day, Dr. Amit Rahul Beshya. Thank you so much for being here with us today, sir. So Dr. Amit is an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Oklahoma. He teaches courses on post-colonial studies, animal studies, cinema, cultural studies, and on special topics including zombies. As an eminent editor, he's been associated with and is also currently working on several editing projects. His monograph, Contemporary Literature from Northeast India, Death, Worlds, Terror, and Survival, was published in 2018. Also a renowned translator, Dr. Amit has extensively been working on translating short stories and novels from Assamese into English. One of his most popular translations is the English translation of Debendranath Acharya's Assamese novel, Jangam, The Movement, which was released in May 2018. Having said this, I would now like to invite Dr. Amit to present his paper. The title of Sir's paper is Translation as an Act of Reading and Interpretation, Reflection by a Translator. The stage is all yours, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, first of all, for the invitation. I thank Dr. Ratnotama Das for inviting me. And what I hope I'll do with this presentation, rather than reading out a paper, I'm going to talk a little bit about how my practices of translation are also kind of connected with my larger theoretical interests. As you may have garnered from the introduction, I work both on questions of sovereignty, and I also work on questions of non-human theory. And I'm currently editing something on the Anthropocene for the journal Postcolonial Studies. So what I'll do, of course, is to kind of contextualize my interest in particular translations in terms of my larger sort of theoretical interest itself. So I'll begin by sharing my screen and going through my PowerPoint so that we can, and I'll stop and talk about it in greater detail as we move on. Can you see the PowerPoint, please? Or can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes, sir.
Okay, excellent. Okay, let me begin with two concepts. I did not get into this concept through my work on Assamese literature, but rather through my work on phonon, which I actually published in a book that I edited called Postcolonial Animalities. And this is the concept of what I call polyvalent-reversibility. And I first used this in an essay on Fanon and Guido Pontecorvo in this particular essay, which later made an appearance in my reading of Arupa Patangia Kulita's Felani, which is an Assamese novel in contemporary literature from Northeast India. The second concept I'll talk about is what I call the untranslated, which is a key conceptual word, for instance, Sakrobehu, which allows me to unlock a text and that I leave untranslated in my translatorial practice. And I'll use two texts as examples in my first case, and one in the second to illustrate these concepts. For polyvalent reversibility, my examples are Felani and Debendranath Acharya's Jangam, and for the untranslated, my example is Dhrubajyoti Bora's novel Kalantara Godya. And I'll give you small descriptions about this novel as we move on, right? So let me begin with my interest. This is where I first began thinking a little bit about how the same word could signify actually different things, right? And here the word is swarm and swarming in Fanon. If the nature of the earth, he says at one point, sometimes this manichaeism reaches its logical conclusion and dehumanizes the colonial subject. In plain talk, he's reduced to the state of an animal. And consequently, when the colonist speaks of the colonized, he uses zoological terms. Allusion is made to the slithery movements of the yellow race, the odors from the native quarters, to the hordes, the stink, the swarming, which is the French word pullulement, and the seething, grouillement, and his gesticulation. So I'll read it up to this point, but I just want you to keep this word swarming in mind. And here it is almost like a description of the colonized as object, almost reduced to the level of an animal, right? So this is almost like a word which reduces the colonized to the level of animals. However, if you think about these particular words, swarming, which is pullulement, and seething, which is grouillement, both terms are related to the world of insects. This sense of the radical otherness of a non-individualized swarm is kind of increased when Fanon describes the teeming, seething colonized as these hysterical masses, those blank faces, those shapeless, obese bodies, this headless, tailless cohort. He's, of course, kind of occupying the gaze of the colonizer and trying to describe the colonized from those terms, right, in this initial one. But then, interestingly, this begins to turn around later on when he uses a different word for swarm, which is the reflexive verb engouffrey. And he says here that the violence which governed the ordering of the colonial world, which tirelessly punctuated the destruction of the indigenous social fabric and demolished unchecked the systems of reference of the country's economy, lifestyles, and modes of dress, the same violence will be vindicated and appropriated when taking history into their own hands, the colonized swarm or engouffrey into the forbidden cities. And this reflexive verb, which means either to swallow up or to rush into, has been translated in the original English translation by Constance Farrington as surges, while Richard Philcox more accurately translates it as a swarm. Now notice the difference though, right? In the first one, it's almost like a noun and it's described as a kind of objective description from the outside. Here, on the other hand, it is a form of activity. And what it shows, for instance, is what you could call the agency of the colonized. And in fact, one of the things that I do, I won't talk about this in great detail. If you want to talk about this during the Q&A, we can talk about it more, is to read this more in terms of contemporary cybernetic theory, where swarming, or what we call swarming activity, represents a form of non-human intelligence. And what I want to do, of course, is to talk about this and bring it, for instance, into the dimension of thinking about the agency of the colonized. This is what I did in that particular essay, which kind of made me think about this concept. So to summarize, what is this concept? My focus in translation and analysis is to focus on the plasticity of words or word clusters that connote different things when placed in different contexts. This, however, is more than poetic polyvalence, because we know that in poetry, words can mean multiple things. As a dabbler in post-human, non-human, and post-colonial theory, my interest lie in how the same terms that can be an objectifying kind of optic can flip around, reverse, and illustrate sometimes imperceptible forms of subjectivity and agency. So let me now turn to Assamese literature, right? The first one would be an example from my translation of Jangam. The second one is from the translation of Felani, which is translated by Deepika Phukan, but I'll also refer to the Assamese original if I need to. So here's a passage from the beginning of Jangam, right, which is about the expulsion of Indians from Burma during World War II. And this passage describes the Indian farmers in the Burmese village of Mangku. And I translate it thus: a group of people compelled to work incessantly for the sake of survival, like some wound up mechanical dolls, tiny ants working by force of habit. Now, interestingly, if you look at the original, the way it goes is Kisuman sabi di thaka jantrik putolar dore, kam kori joa kisuman guri porwa, right? So effectively, Jantrik Putola Dore, which means like some wound up mechanical doll. Okay, notice, just like in the first passage in Fanon, this is almost like a description of the farmers as object, right? Like some wound up mechanical doll, so to speak, in some sense, right? However, in chapter 19, it's a very harrowing chapter, and probably my favorite chapter in the novel, as the Indian refugees are marching through the Death Valley of the Hukawng, right? And many people are dying on the way. They see all these corpses lined up, for instance. This is during the time of World War II, right? It begins to mean something else. The same word sort of recurs again. The same word, which is based, or the same expression, which is sabidi thoa jantrik putola dore, right? And I translate this section thus: life, only life, in this endless journey of life, illness and inertia are valueless. This is just a grotesque carnival of movement. To stop means certain death and meaningless silence. There was no conversation or contemplation on the faces of these people, as if they were like some wound up mechanical dogs, like Jantrik Putola, that progress forward at their own pace. Now, notice what's happening here, right? If the refugees stop, they die. They are literally swallowed by nature. The word is grach, right? The only resource for survival in this death world is to proceed slowly like wound up mechanical dolls or like Jantrik Putola. Thus, what we could say, the animal and mechanical metaphors that signify a separation from the human, for the residents of Manku earlier twist around and becomes descriptors for a stubborn will to survive in this terrifying green tunnel of death. So there's this kind of shift going on, that polyvalent shift that I talked about, the reversible shift. But the same term begins to mean something else, almost like a form of subjective agency or a form of survival for that matter. Let me give you another example. This is from Orupa Patonga Kolita's Fenani, again, a novel about a group of working class women who survived after a bout of ethnic violence. It's a brilliant novel about female agency and especially female collective agency. An example of the deployment of objectifying descriptions is the repetition of Guripura, or in the description of abundant populations in Felani. The reference to people as ants seems almost pejorative or objectifying again initially. They huddle together like ants trembling with fear. They resemble one major let me just pull this up. They resemble one major group of ants ready to be washed away by floods. The devastation of their homes make it seem as if a cyclone had hit a colony of ants as they were about to build new anthills. And the women weep together, huddled together like a group of ants floating on a sea of water. If you notice all these descriptions, these are taken from different pages again. Again, the ants seem like, again, this kind of objectifying description, just like the swarm metaphor that we talked about, or the wound up mechanical dolls. But notice what happens again, right? This is towards the end of the novel, and this is where the same metaphor turns around and becomes something else. The market days become somewhat regular. Even if someone called a bond, the army made sure the shops remained open. There were rumors that yet another bond was scheduled, this time for 1,000 hours. Even though the market was smaller now, people were busy trying to save money for the impending rainy days. They were like ants before the floods, hurrying and scurrying with eggs in their mouths. Now, in the previous reference, ants are depicted almost as passive figures that are acted upon by death-like forces of sovereignty, right? However, in this sentence, they were like ants before the floods, hurrying and scurrying with eggs in their mouth. We are provided with a brief glimpse of survival strategies that ants deploy in the face of deluges. They anticipate danger and scurry about to prepare for the approaching catastrophe. And in fact, one of the interesting things which happens in Felani at the end is that these group of women come together and they are almost like these reeds which are constantly torn away but keep on coming back. They can constantly torn away, keep on coming back. So these naturalistic metaphors, which seem like objectifying descriptions earlier, turn around again, as I said, and show a different form of agency, often shown through what we call these animal or non-human metaphors for that matter, right? So that's the first concept I wanted to talk about. Let me move on to my second one, right? Which is what I call the concept of the untranslated. My example here is the use of the English loanword routine in Dhruv Bora's sort of magnificent novel on a period of terror in Assam, which is called Kolantara Goddo, which you can just kind of translate as the prose of Tempest. I haven't translated this text, but I have translated some portion of it for my segment on Bora and Kolantara Goddo. When I translated it, I italicized the word routine to signify its loanword status. Also, what I would kind of give a sort of a reminder is not to conflate untranslated with untranslatable. The latter signifies terms that don't have direct equivalence. By the untranslated, I mean terms left untranslated in my translation. And I could give you another example in my Q&A section from Jahirul Hussein's famous short story, Horo Demali, Bor Demali, which is the word Sokorbehu, which for me are keys for unlocking the meanings of a story, right? So this word is pretty much the hinge, if you think about it, for me to kind of unlock the meaning of the story itself. So this word routine, right? Now, just to give a brief description of Kolantara Goddo, it's a kind of massive novel told through multiple perspectives, both urban and rural, which talks about the period of, kind of post 1990 Operation Bajrang and that period of terror which happened in Assam, right? And one of the major sections deals with this person called Prabhat Hazarika, who is a victim of torture there. He's a young boy who's picked up by the Indian army and who's brutally tortured and so on. It begins, of course, with descriptions of routinized repetitions that which characterize a sense of the everyday. And this is a description of his father, Narayan Hazarika's world. It begins with this. It was as if the world was much simpler then. The world was enmeshed in a predictable rhythm and simple pattern, right? One's success was thought to be dependent on good results in examinations and taking a practically oriented stream that eventually culminated in a degree in medicine, engineering, or the like. Line Lua, which of course I translated as taking a fixed orientation in life, then it was called Line Lua. Once that direction was taken, the future seemed assured. A government job, marriage, a relatively uncomplicated sexual life sanctioned by society, children, the construction of one or two houses, buying a second-hand, if not brand new car, and growing old slowly among some comforts. Again, for me, a passage like this shows in some sense kind of like this idea of routinized repetition, which characterizes what we call the ordinary or the notion of everyday life, right? But it begins with this kind of evocation of what you call everyday or ordinary life. And then the English loan word routine is kind of used directly when Prabhat is picked up by the police on the suspicion that he's been working with insurgents, right? And when Prabhat has to make repeated visits to the station, the constable tells his father, Narayan Hazarika, don't worry, this is a matter of routine. Absolutely a matter of routine, right? So of course, the word that is used in the Assamese text itself is routine, right? So it's effectively that in some ways, even this kind of interrogation is kind of integrated into what you could call the fabric of the everyday, so to speak, right? Of course, things go downhill from there. Tada is declared, the army comes in. Because of some suspicions, Prabhat is taken away. He's brutally tortured, right, for a period of about a week or so, and then he's then thrown into prison because of Tada. His father literally gets aged with worry, right, and his whole trust in the world begins to disintegrate. Their whole trust, for instance, in what we call the everyday rhythms of life begin to disintegrate. And my cue for sort of thinking about the importance of the word routine comes back towards the end of the Prabhat section in this novel, where the word routine is again used, but in a peculiarly ironic way. And here, one of the major characters of the novel, the cynical lawyer Choudhury, he talks about, Prabhat, who has been basically going through this Tada courts, and of course, after that, this whole way of running, for instance, after every judgment and so on. So I'm going to read this section out. What news of the boy? Choudhury queried. He's now in a special jail, Partha said. Did his family members meet him? They are allowed to meet him once a week. The poor man, I feel very bad for the family. Is that the only family? Orup said. There are so many families like theirs. Special families, special court, special jail. And then Choudhury says, This is nowadays routine, Partho, a fixed routine, Choudhury opined. A visit to the jail, a consultation with the lawyer on this day, a hearing in court, a fixed routine. And yet life goes on with food, sleep, sex, ha ha ha. And if you notice here again, think about how the word routine is used at the beginning, line, dua, and routine, in terms of these quotidian rhythms, and the way it sort of transforms and becomes almost warped. And a certain corrupted notion of the word routine itself comes out. A visit to the jail, a consultation with the lawyer, on this day, a hearing of the court, it has now become a fixed routine of these people whose world has completely been destroyed by state terror, so to speak. So this kind of reversal that you find, for instance, in particular narratives like those by Dhruv Bora, for instance, becomes a key for me to kind of analyze the shifting meanings of these words, and of course to think of this through the notion of translation itself. So let me conclude by talking a little bit about the differences between these two concepts, right? With polyvalent reversibility, I focus more on the movement from object to subject, right? So when something is described as an object, right, let's say swarm, let's say porua, for instance, ants and so on. So it's a transformation. And this is where my own interest in non-human theory begins to come in, because what non-human theory asks you to think about is really the agency of what we consider non-human. And I think there are certain elective affinities that are shared between what we call the non-human and what we call the colonized, or what we call the oppressed, so to speak, in some sense. On the other hand, with the untranslated, the focus is more on a key term or metaphor that either displays the spatial and temporal experiences of living in constricted space states. For instance, in this other story that I translated on Assam's secret killings, which is by Zahirul Hussain, which is Horu Dhemali Bor Dhemali, one of the key words there is Sakrabehu, right? Which is, of course, coming from the Mahabharata, right? And then that, in a way, you could translate that as labyrinth, but I don't think it quite captures the whole idea of being entrapped, for instance, within a certain notion of what you call space and time, which comes up in a death world. Or it shows, for that matter, the disintegration of worlds, which is what we saw with that loanword routine, for instance, in Dhruv Bora's text. And I'd like to sort of end with two takeaways. My connection between translation and the literary. First, my focus on particular reversible terms or keywords for translatorial interpretation often depends on a method of reading where the text is conceptualized as a web. You touch one strand, it resonates somewhat differently elsewhere in the body of the text, pretty much like in a kaleidoscope. Second, such repetitions of key terms that may mean different things in different situations shows what I call the literariness of the text in question. And by literary, I mean the fine-honed sense to which one word, expression, or phrase can open up kaleidoscopic meanings to multiple resonances across the web of the text. And frankly, if you ask me about my translatorial practice, the texts that interest me are more texts that think about, that sort of express this in terms of this web-like relationship. Words that can be traced through its multiple significations and its polyvalent meanings as we move on. And on that note, I'd like to end, and hopefully if you have any questions, I can answer them at this point. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir. This was amazing. And I have personally learned a lot from this presentation. And how certain terms and words can be read in multiple ways. I think that's brilliant. So we do have questions for you, and I'll just be reading out. So we have a question from Jyotirmoy Pradhani, and he congratulates you on the presentation, and he says, very perceptive presentation. You've opened up a new area to reflect on. And then he asks, from the Anthropocene perspectives, how do you operate or at times manipulate, if at all, to assign voices and agency to the unvoiced in your translations, even if they might have remained muted in the original?
Thank you very much. The problem with the Anthropocene, and here let me just go through for people who may be unclear with this term. I mean, it refers, of course, to a geological epoch where human beings have become global agents in some sense, in a way in which other non-human forces, let's say storms and so on were earlier, so to speak, in some sense. So we are human, but we have almost become a non-human force in the planet, so to speak, in some ways, right? The other way, of course, which the Anthropocene opens for us is to think about a critique of what we call anthropocentricity, which is the idea that humans are placed at the center of the universe. I mean, in many ways, when we talk about anthropocentrism, it seems like the meaning flows from the human to the outside. It begins with a strong cleavage between what you could call human and non-human worlds, right? And I think a lot of non-human theory, and especially in the Anthropocene, the connections between Anthropocene and non-human theory comes precisely from that point, um, that in some sense, what we consider dead, what we consider, for instance, non-living, might give some surprising forms of agency. I'll give you an example, Jotinboy, right? In my reading of Felani, one of the things which I tried to do, of course, was to think, for instance, about the agency of things or objects, right? One of the ways in which I tried to kind of open up Felani from the reading of a humanist allegory is to precisely think about the roles of material objects in text. And one of the things that constantly happen in Felani is that she keeps on looking at her bangles, the bangles that she wears, and the bangles begin to attract attention, so to speak. It opens up portals to the past, life-sustaining past, which in some sense, in her moments of reverie, connect her with more kind of egalitarian forms of community in some sense. Her mother, for instance, marrying her mother marrying a Bengali person, her grandmother, for instance, eloping with a Boro Mahout, and so on and so forth. So there's this whole idea that in some sense, there's already a form of hybridity at the origin. But this is all impelled by the attention that the bangles kind of ask of her. So she's grinding spices, something very ordinary, let's say she's grinding spices. And at that point, the light begins to fall, for instance, on the bangles. She's attracted to what the bangles are in some sense, and she begins reflecting on those bangles, the history of those bangles. And that becomes a way for her to open up the portals of the past. And that's one way in which you can sort of think, for instance, about the agency of the non-human. When we say agency, of course, it doesn't have to be conscious. It is a way of acting on the world. The bangles act on her, the human interlocutor, so to speak, in some ways. So within the Anthropocene, that's a frame of reading, for instance, that I think can be sort of furthered. Let's say stones, how they insist on our attention, so to speak. I mean, I'm currently writing a chapter on stones, for instance, in my new book, and that talks a lot, for instance, about the agency of stones and how they insist on our attention. Again, we have to start sort of absurd thinking of this within conscious paradigm, so to speak, in some ways, right? So that's how I would respond to that question. Would you like me to go to the next one?
Yes, sir. So we have another question from Ratnotma ma'am.
Mm-hmm.
And she begins with thanking you for the thought-provoking paper. And then she asks that, do you deliberately apply translation theories while translating a text?
Okay. I think this question could also speak to Basudev Das's question, because I think they're pretty similar questions. So I'll answer both these questions together, right? Let me take you through my own personal trajectory. I mean, when I was a student in JNU, my specialization during my master's was in translation theory, and I went through all of that, the alienating translation, the domesticating translation, Venuti, and all these people, right? Do I apply translation theory to my reading of the text? If what my talk really was about trying to figure out my own practice of translation through my interest in non-human theory. So I wouldn't say that a knowledge of, let's say, the arcana of translation theory is necessary, so to speak, in terms of thinking about translation per se. But I think every translator kind of approaches the translation through their own kind of formed or unformed theoretical standpoint. For me, for instance, as I said, I think the larger interest that I have in translation and the type of text that I'm interested in translating are the ones which play around with questions of non-human or, for that matter, animal agency. Those are the ones that I end up translating. I'm translating, for instance, short stories on dogs right now, because, again, the interest is basically in thinking, for instance, about the inner life of dogs, so to speak, in some sense. So that's largely been my interest. So I wouldn't say that, a knowledge of translation theory per se, the way it is understood, in a more sort of theoretical directions is necessary per se, right? But what I think is important is the way in which we reflect on our own personal theories of translation itself. And what I try to do, of course, in my talk is to kind of present that particular trajectory, what interests me, and how, for instance, I approach that through the lens of non-human theory and so on.
So we have a lot of compliments and many more questions for you in the chat box. I will now be reading out a question that has been asked by Ruchi Rana. And she thanks you for the interesting presentation. And she asks, the word Jangam is usually associated with wandering religious monks and mobility. Could you tell us how the word attains more polyvalent nature in its relation with the story told in the novel that's also an actual event in history?
Okay. This is a very good question, and I thank you for asking me that. Jangam, of course, like you pointed out, one way of translating it, and I left the title untranslated, right? One way of translating it, of course, is the movement. And I think one of the ways of thinking about this particular story is not so much in terms of what we call classic plotting, but one way of reading the story is really through the question of movement itself, right? So the notion of movement, I think, is kind of fundamental to the dynamics and the physics of the text, so to speak, right? If you think about it, what is the story about? The story is about a kind of exodus of Indians from Burma, right? A lot of people die on the way. So what you are seeing around you is a huge panorama of death, right? Now, in that panorama of death, how does life proceed? Life proceeds through movement. And effectively, that's what the story is about. I mean, that's the way I would read the story in some sense. The plot, really, if you think about it, clear beginnings, middles, and ends. That's in a way there. They leave Burma, they're in the journey, they get back, for instance, to Assam and so on, and a few of them survive. But the real dynamic of the whole plot really is the question of movement itself. And what I think it captures is movement and its relationship to the question of survival in life. And I think in that sense, definitely the word Jangam begins to have many of these polyvalent meanings that you are asking about in some ways. Thank you.
All right, sir. Thank you so much. So there is another question, and I hope I can take it.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a question asked by Sar Singh, and he thanks you for the lecture, and he asks, literature on the ideological significance of translation studies in literature to power. Can you
Mm-hmm.
explain this?
Okay. This is a complex question to answer, and I would say what I was very happy to hear about this particular translation seminar is that you did not simply invite people who are translating Assamese texts into English, like me or Pratibha Sarjo, for instance, but you're also inviting people who are translating Assamese texts into other languages, so to speak, in some ways. And I think in terms of what you talk about, the ideological significance of translation studies in relation to power and agency, while on the one hand, we can definitely think about English as a kind of global power language, which allows a certain visibility, let's say, within a larger sort of capitalist system on a global level and so on. I would definitely say that when you talk about the question of agency, let's say an Assamese text being translated into Uriya or Sinhala, for instance, right, shows a different model of circulation. And I think this is what could complicate not only our notion of what national literature is, but what our notion of world literature is, so to speak, in some ways, right? For instance, I grew up as a reader who would often read many French texts mediated through English in Assamese translation. Like the first time I read The Plague was in Assamese translation, right? But it was actually not translated from the French text, it was translated from the English one, so to speak, in some ways. I think there's a multiple level of mediation which is going on there. And I think that question becomes very much fundamental to the question of agency that you're asking in many ways. That on the one hand, when we are thinking, whether we think about the sort of Pascal Casanova argument that in some ways the translation into power languages creates this whole sense of world literature and so on. And I think that can be complicated by the circulation of texts, let's say, an Assamese text into Oriya, an Assamese text, for instance, into Punjabi, a Punjabi text, for instance, maybe even into Malay for that matter, right? I think this opens up different circulations of text, which also bring up very different notions of how reception happens and how forms of agency can be conceptualized, I would say.
Thank you so much, sir. So I'll just take one last observation, and we would like to hear your views about it. So Rajendra Mehta sir writes that
Mhm,
the Gujarati translations of almost all the Assamese texts are horrific, mediocre, nonsensical, and ridiculous. And the
mhm,
common among all is that all are published by Sahitya Academy. It seems there is no agency in India which can provide the pool of translators for Indian languages.
mhm. See, again, I can't say too much about the Gujarati translations of Assamese. Clearly, I don't read Gujarati in that sense, so I'm going off what you're saying. But it goes back to my other question as well. I think the question of a particular agency that can be and I do think that there are two different impulses to this. One, of course, is Sahitya Academy still operates largely within the notion of as a circulation of a national literature, right? Whereas one could also say that there are translations of text or intertext translations, which very often go against what we call the national paradigm as well, right? And as I said, the example of translations, for instance, of Bengali text or Odia text into Assamese, which were not necessarily sanctioned, for instance, by the Sahitya Academy, are interesting things in their own regard, so to speak, in some ways. Many of them, which have also helped in what we could call the evolution of Assamese literature overall, right? So I would say definitely in some ways that um, whether there should be an agency which is also in some sense pushed by a certain ideology, if it is there, well and good. But I do think there are many of these other forms of translation that often occur without many of these official agencies as well. And there's a story to be written about those translations and how they circulate ideas, how they, for instance, circulate notions of literature as well. As I said, the fact that we read Plague by Camus, for instance, in Assamese, which sometimes is translated from the English translation of a French original, I think is an interesting act of displacement in itself. It's never quite, you're not quite translating it from the French original, you're translating it from the English translation, right? And in doing that, there's an interesting kind of shift which happens, which opens up interesting questions of reception as well. But this could also happen, for instance, with translations, for instance, that we have read of Bengali text into Assamese as well. Many of these, which actually happen without the mediation of the Sahitya Academy, so to speak, right? Many of the Bengali texts I read, and I do read Bengali as well, but many of the Bengali texts that I read in the beginning were were sometimes in Assamese translation as well. And I think these are interesting things to think about through the frameworks of reception and how notions of literature and publics, reading publics, are really created. So that would be my kind of partial answer to that question. Sorry.
Thank you so much, sir, for answering all the questions patiently. There are a lot of compliments flooded in the chat box, and you can definitely take a look at them. Thank you
Thank you
once
so
again
much.
for being here with us, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me.
All right, sir. So now we'll be moving on to the next presentation, and we have
So I
with
think
us.
I'll leave then. Okay.
Yes, sir.
I'll probably leave because it's late at night. So good night, everyone.
All right. Good night,
Sorry.
sir.
Take
All
care.
right.
Bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so
Thank you
much
for
again.
being
Yeah.
here. All right. So now we'll be moving on to the next presentation, and we have with us Miss Arushi Malik. Miss Malik is a comparative scholar who explores the cultural representation of women in anti-colonial literature in Indian languages and English in her work. She holds double masters from the University of Delhi and Centennial College, Toronto, Canada. At present, she is working as a PR representative with a Toronto-based firm. So I now request you, ma'am, to take over. And the title of your paper is Spectre of Class Politics in Patmugi by Lakshminath Besbarua. All right, ma'am, the stage is all yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to this webinar, Manvi. The topic of my presentation is Spectre of Class Politics in Patmugi by Lakshminath Bezubaroy. I have analyzed the Lakshminath Bezubaroy story uh, Patmugi English translation by Sunil Kumar Barthokar's translation. I would divide my presentation into four parts. First, I would talk about the author because most of the readers who read Indian literature, they must not be aware about the author. Then I would talk about the caste system, how it is prevalent in India, and how it is reflected in the story. And finally, I will talk about the intertextuality in the text. So the narrative of the story could be read as a blend of a romance and a satire, so we can call it as romantical satire. Not a lot of people who read Indian literature would be aware of the writer Lakshminath Bezuburoy, so I would like to briefly introduce him. Well, the writer was born in 1864 and died in 1938. He is an Indian poet, novelist, and playwright in the modern Assamese literature. He was one of the literary stalwarts of the Junaki area, which is also known as the age of romanticism in the Assamese literature. Uh, Lakshminath responded to the prevailing social environment through his satirical works to bring and sustain positive changes to the former. His literature is deep. His literature is reflected deeper urges of the people in the Assam. Well, the Lakshminath story Patmuki tackles the caste system in Assam. I'm sure everyone would have an idea about the caste system prevalent in the Brahminical society of India. I would like to give a very brief explanation on the caste system existing, or I would say prevalent in India. India's caste system is amongst the most oldest form of the surviving social stratification, which divides Hindus into rigid hierarchical groups based on their karma and the dharma. It is generally accepted to be more than 3,000 years old. Manusmriti, which is widely regarded to be one of the most important and authoritative book of Hindu law, dating back to 1,000 years before the Christ was born, it acknowledges that and justifies that caste system as the basis of order and regularity of the society. It divides majorly into the four categories, that is Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and the Shudras. At the top of the hierarchy, where the Brahmins were mainly the teachers, intellectuals, and believed to have come from the Brahma's head. Then come to the Kshatriyas, the warriors, the rulers, supposedly from the arms. The third slot went to the Vaishyas, the traders, who were created from their thighs. At the bottom of the heap were the Shudras who come from the Brahma's feet and did all the menial jobs. Outside of this Hindu caste culture, there were Achuts, the Dalits, or the untouchables. For centuries, this caste has dictated almost every aspect of Hindu religious and social life, with each group occupying a specific place in this complex hierarchy. Rural communities have long been arranged on the basis of these castes, where they have been designated to work. The upper caste and lower caste always segregated in the segregated colonies. Like water wells were not shared, Brahmins were not allowed to drink the food and which Shudras used to drink, and one could marry only in the one's own caste. This system bestowed many privileges on the upper caste while sanctioning the repression of the lower caste by privileged groups. Often criticized for being unjust and regressive while it remained virtually unchanged for centuries, trapping people into the fixed social orders from which it was impossible to escape. A very interesting aspect of the story is that it is narrated from the third person point of view, who belongs to a lower caste, which is the Shudras community. Hence, the story is giving the voice to the subaltern people in the Assam. I would like to relate this aspect to the Gayatri Spivak's subaltern studies, where it mentions that if you want to represent the subaltern community, then it has to be the third person's voice. How caste system was reflected in the story, I would depict this through three instances. The very first instance was when the narrator, a middle-aged man, describes his community and his village, that they are the potters, that they are the lower caste people. I would like to read a sentence from the story. The narrator used to say that we used to make earthenwares for the grown-ups and clay toy for the young ones. We sold them in the bazaar and from door to door and managed to squeeze out a living from that craft. Of late, our business came to stand still. All kinds of foreign goods have flooded our land. The imported toys have driven out our clay rattles, leg dishes, and small lime pots from the market. Knowing no better, we gave up the profession of our ancestors. We have taken to agriculture with what little land we had, and come down to us from the fathers and grandfathers. The description clearly portrays that how potters were pertained to do the menial jobs because of their caste, as Shudras were always bonded to do these menial jobs. The second instance I would like to reflect on the narrator's neighbor, daughter Patmuki, who is the protagonist of the story. Well, Patmuki in the Assamese means beautiful. So this Patmuki is a beautiful young woman who falls in the love for a Brahmin boy from the another village. Although she convinced her village elders to allow her for the marriage, the couple married and lived with her mother happily for a year. Suddenly, over one night, the husband disappears. Patmuki is distraught, but the narrator finds that the husband has gone back to his village, undergone a purification ritual, and married a girl of his own caste. It clearly portrays that how a woman falls prey to the caste politics, as Patmuki falls in love with the Brahmin boy, and by going against the society rules of the caste system, she married him. Unfortunately, the marriage was a failure, and she discovered that her husband has undergone a purification ritual and married a girl of his own caste. Caste system always encourages an individual to perform the marriage in the same caste. The third instance from the story which depicts the caste system is when Patmuki decides to seek a legal redress, when she went to the lawyer with her mother and her uncle for their revenge. But as soon as she reaches the lawyer, who tells him that the case would be difficult, she was about to leave. She left her hand on the door and tells the lawyer that she has changed her mind. She said that she has already had proofs of betrayal, cruelty, and the weakness of the male sex, and leaves the office. Patmuki left the office without uttering a word to her mother. And she told her uncle that during the last few days, I saw a lot and learned a lot of things. I do not want any more of that wild Brahmin. The description clearly portrays that how Patmuki liberated herself from the caste politics by denying the trap of the caste system. She decided to follow the path of God, which is the ultimate truth, and to work for the nation by following the principles of Gandhi. Now, here Gandhi is an interesting figure where she's trying to say that Gandhi, who was a great leader and stood against the caste system and believed in the equality, she decided to follow Gandhi, irrespective of the fact that she would have been following Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar. She also mentioned about that God is truth and truth alone is God. She's quoting the great Assamese religious reformer of the 16th century, John Rabdob. She says that the only true worship is to see God in all beings, and she decided to follow the path of Gandhi. Caste system has acted like a ghost in the story of Patmuki. The narrator is unable to identify the caste system, and it keeps on haunting throughout the story to all the characters. But Patmuki, the protagonist of the story, liberated herself from the evil of caste system by following the Gandhi principles and worshipping the god. Caste system act as a specter of class politics in this story. I have few takeaways on my translation. In the first place, when I read this English translation of the story, it shows that language must be viewed not as a cognitive construct, but as a shared of set of habits using the voice of communication. This set of habits have developed within society, is transmitted by society, and is learned with the social setting. This implies a clear shift away from abstract and reductionist approach to language and towards the social linguistic context of performance in both encoding and decoding messages communicated by multiple codes. This also means that both encoding and decoding in the dialogic engagement between the source and receptors, anticipatory feedback is important. In the second place, language must also be viewed as potentially and actually idiocentric and sociocentric, in the sense that people may create new types of expression, may construct new literary forms, and may attach new significance to older forms of expression. Discourse, in fact, it becomes as matter of fashion as any other element of communication, and outstanding communicators can set new standards and initiate new trends. Well, the advantages of this new socio-semiotic approach of translations are found in employing a realistic epistemology, which can speak relevantly about the real world of everyday experience, since its basis as triadic relation between sign, referent, and interpretant. The process of this interpretation based on the system of signs and on the dialogic function of the society. Second of all, being at the cutting edge of the verbal creativity rather than being bound by the reductionist requirements which depends on ideal speaker horrors which never exist. Well, throughout the story, we see that caste system has haunted like a ghost in the story, which reminds me of the Henrik Ibsen's novel Ghost, where this figure of speech is not only acting as a realistic ghost, but as a social ghost, where it depicts the caste system, while it's haunting every character of the story. But Patmugi, the protagonist of the story, is the only character who understands that how she has to liberate herself from this evil caste. And by following the principles of Gandhi, she outstanded in the story. And throughout the story, there is this specter of class politics. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for bringing up some very pertinent issues like caste politics and caste discrimination. And it was a very elaborate and an engaging paper. I'm sure we have questions. Let me just check the chat box. So, all right. Ratnotma ma'am has congratulated you and complimented you. She thanks you for discussing the text. And then we also have a compliment from Basudev Das sir, and he says, beautiful presentation. Here, I would just like to mention another prominent novel of Homan Boroghain, totally based on caste system. The novel is Mastas Gandha, which has been translated into Bengali by me. Patmugi is a well-known story. Okay. And we have a question from Sire Singh, and he asks, what are the subaltern communities according to B.R. Ambedkar? Would you like to talk a bit about this?
I'm not very sure about this answer, so I wouldn't like to answer this question. I was more focusing on the Gandhi's principle, so I haven't gone through the B.R. Ambedkar subaltern communities.
All right, no worries, ma'am. Let me just check if we have any more questions. In the meanwhile, I wanted to know a little more about the connection that you have drawn with this text and Ibsen's Ghost. Could you talk a bit about that?
Well, I read this novel Ghost by Henrik Ibsen, which talks about a ghost, which is a social ghost, which talks about throughout the novel it talks about a ghost which was not in the realistic sense but in the social sense. So when I was reading this short story, I inferred the story with the same sense that this ghost is the caste which is existing and prevalent in the entire village, which is which everybody in in the story was haunted by this ghost. And it was just similar to the story which I've read in Henrik Ibsen's novel. So that's why I thought maybe it would be a nice intertextuality to relate both the text.
So we have a compliment from Papuri Senapati. I'm sorry for the wrong pronunciation. I'm really happy that you've taken up Lakshminath Besbaria's novel for your presentation. It has been a very informative session. All right. So thank you so much for being here with us, ma'am. And it was wonderful listening to you. And we look forward to hearing you again. All right. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Manvi.
All right. So with this, we move on to the third presentation. And now we have with us Dr. Venkatramaya. Sir is an assistant professor at the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies, University of Delhi. He has been a part of the MIL family since 2008, and he holds a master's, an MPhil, and a PhD from the University of Hyderabad. Sir's major area of interest lies in Telugu language and literature. Thank you so much, sir, for being here with us. A very warm welcome to you. And Sir will be speaking on the Telugu translation of Neelkanthi Braja. Thank you, sir. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Mandavi. Andariki namaskaram. Respected moderator, Ms. Mandavi, convener, Dr. Ratnotnama Das Garu, head of the department, Professor P.C. Patnaik Garu, my other colleagues, friends, namaste to one and all. Title of my paper is The Telugu Translation of Neelakanta Braja. Before going to start my presentation, just I want to tell one small thing. Initially, when Madam informed me that I think there is a one international webinar on Assamese literature in translation, I myself requested Madam, I want to present a paper if you give me permission. Why I asked? Because generally I think most of the papers, it is based on English translation. My paper is completely based on only Telugu. The reason is that when I joined in the department, I heard Professor Indra Madam. Many people, they told that I think Madam is one of the great personality in the department. After going through even Madam's event, everything, one time luckily even I had seen her in the department when Patnaik sir arranged one complete, I think, national seminar on Madam's writing. Not last 10 months, I think, because of the pandemic. Before that, we used to take classes in, sometime even MPhil classes in seminar hall. So maybe because of that, minimum 3 to 4 days, I have to see Indra Madam's photo. Every time I believe that, okay, looking at Madam's photo is a great thing. But another thing is that though Madam is a great even the poetess and even great writer, I did not read anything. I thought that one day maybe without knowing any information, I'm telling so many people that no, Madam is a great person. I thought that maybe it is in Hindi, like maybe wrong Hindi, mujhe path milega. Without knowing information, I'm telling so many things. So at least maybe in this way, I may read at least one information of Madam's writing. And another thing is that I want to give, I'm very thankful to Patnaik sir one thing, because there is a title, Assamese, the writings in translation, at the same time theory and practice also, because I don't have any information. I told sir, I'm little bit worried about this title. Sir told me only one thing, don't leave the second part, focus only on one part, Telugu translation of even Neelakanta Braja, this is the title. So I immediately informed same thing to Madam also, because my title was also finalized by Patnaik sir and opportunity was given by Madam. I'm very thankful. Now the title of the Telugu work is The Kannaya Vadalo Kriredalu, that is the shadowy in Kannaya means Lord Krishna, in Krishna's street. It was translated by Mr. Palakodeti Krishnamurthy. He retired from retired as a deputy registrar in High Court of Andhra Pradesh earlier. He translated even other works also, two of other works also. One is Chinnamasta, another one is Ramaviharam. Even Indra Madam's another work is also translated by Professor Gangishet Lakshmarayana. But I have only one work that is available in my Telugu translation, that is actually printed in Little magazine. The name of the magazine is Choudhury in 2015 January. So I'm going to speak only on Telugu translation, and the limitation of my paper is I did not look at the English translation of Neelakanta Brajas. So I have completely focused only on Telugu. So whatever, because I don't want to speak about even translation theory or any kind of information, because that is completely away from my, I think, even knowledge, because I did not look at even any English translation. That is also one problem for me, because I did not get time to look at that work. The second one is that I'm going to look at this because yesterday there was one speaker presented very good paper on the same topic. My focus is, it is a kind of maybe comparative analysis of Nilakanta Braja, or maybe you can say that Bhakti cult of maybe Brindavan, and the South Indian Bhakti cult, especially completely related to Veera Vaishnavism or Vishishtadvaitam. So generally, these two things are very important in my paper when I want to compare the Brindavan Bhakti cult and again the South Indian Bhakti cult. Because when it comes to the Telugu or translation, sometime I understood that whether it is a translation of Assamese writing or the real, I think maybe the original novel of Telugu, because I did not face any problem anywhere, because almost all the names, because the entire Bhakti literature or Bhakti cult, the names of our characters' names, everything, it is very close to Telugu, except some of the information related to the Brindavan, the places, because many people, maybe South Indian people, we are familiar with even this concept and everything. When I want to look at this one, I want to look at from historical perspective, because I had a kind of minimum knowledge about the Bhakti cult, Bhakti literature. But when I look at the Nilakanta Braja or Kannaiwadalo Krinidalu in Telugu, I was really a kind of maybe shocked in for more than 2 days, because it is completely different kind of maybe Bhakti cult from south to north. I believe that because the Vaishnavism also, it traveled from south to north. There, what is actually interesting thing, this entire even, I want to look at even this Brindavan, the women's, the issue and everything. It started from again the Jainism and Buddhism, where the Matha cult, the Matha means the where places are the saints they were living. So it is a kind of reflection available even in the same novel, because I understood that it has, I think, if one can look at even thousands, I think maybe hundreds of years history of even this entire, even the cult. Basically in Jainism, Buddhism, after a certain period, this Matha cult provided a kind of live-in relationship, male and female, they can stay together. So it is not a sin, it's not a path. So even one can have any kind of relationship, especially after the same kind of maybe the culture, it entered even into the Vaishnavism, Shaivism also. In Vaishnavism, in Veera Vaishnavism, or even there are so many different kind of cult that I don't want to focus on this information. In Shaivism also, it is available in Natha Sampradaya. So where the guru, or you can say the teacher, has complete control over Shishya or any other person. Here Shishya means students, means especially the disciple, the female. So the guru is almost like a behaving like a another Krishna. What is very strange thing, especially in the Bhakti cult, I found two interesting things. It both are completely vice versa. What are that thing? Generally in Bhakti culture, we believe that the most successful love between the god or maybe the goddesses, that is especially Radha and Krishna, because the Krishna is the one who really worshipped, even I'm using this word because I think in based on some Telugu word, sometimes because he is very loyal to Radha, and their love is a kind of maybe symbolic, maybe love even for the entire, even the Bhakti cult. Similarly, in entire Vaishnavism, because why Krishna loves Radha means, because we know, as we know, everyone know that Radha is not a wife, because most of the people, including whether human being or maybe non-human being, nobody, I think most of the people, they have issues with wife, but they love other people than even wife. That is something different. Because even I also believe the same case even in gods also. Same case even in Ranganatha and Godadevi. Especially if I look at even the female saints, almost out of 10 saints, I think even the Ammayar, even if I look at even the Andal, Akka Mahadevi, Mirabai, Lal Dead, Janabai, Bahini Bai, Vengamamba, when I look at all these people, the most successful love is, according to the even historical information, Andal and even Ranganatha Swami, one of the avatar of Lord Vishnu. But where these two people, their Radha Krishna and again Ranganatha Swami and Goda Devi, their love is completely successful. But unfortunately, what happened? very strange thing is that in Brindavan, that is completely vice versa, because there is no love at all. There is only one thing, they kind of maybe pathetic conditions of women. They are imagining Lord Krishna as a beloved one, but unfortunately the beloved one is not available, and they are not getting even any kind of food. They don't have any kind of facilities. They don't have any treatment. They were literally, I think almost several people, they died due to the knowledge of this kind of, maybe you can say that, blind belief. So it is very horrible, where we are looking at Radha Krishna and Ranganatha Swami and Godadevi, a kind of symbol for love. But when it comes to the humans, so I understood that the Vaishnavism, especially in South Indian culture, in Bhakti, after certain period, the Veera Vaishnavism promoted Madhura Bhakti. In Madhura Bhakti, especially the tradition, there was only one thing: try to have complete luxury life. Even in Vaishnavism, most of the people, if I look at even the 16th century, the South Indian history, majority of the Vaishnavas, they try to even follow the luxury life. When it comes to the Brindavan, I found that I think almost all that is completely opposite. They didn't have that kind of thing. They are thinking there. I believe that they misunderstood even the concept of salvation. People are ready to save money for their cremation. So they don't want to think about their life when they are alive. They want to think about their life after death. And unfortunate thing is that where I understood one very basic information, somehow majority of the people, they misunderstood the concept. They want to even get death only in Brindavan. So they have traveled to even Brindavan, they want to live. So here, I am really surprised that why there is a kind of maybe change from South Indian Bhakti cult to North Indian cult. Because somewhere, when we come to the South India, there are so many historical issues. Since it is recording, I don't want to talk about all these things, because there are so many other problems also. Here, in South India, because there they have a kind of influence of even the Muslim community, where they have complete, I think, proper life. So they were also influenced. They had also the same kind of similar life. When it comes to the North, they also had the same kind of lifestyle, but it was in complete different perspective. When I look at even the characters also, one major problem is the understanding the priest and the temple culture. Initially, even in South India also, in ancient period, the temple culture began, the priest culture also began, even Devadasi cult also began, everything began. But when it comes to the Brindavan cult, that is completely opposite. Here in the priest cults, especially in the entire the work, of course, Madam has given, the Indra Madam has given maybe mostly, I think, historical information and true information. I never find any kind of bhakti in the entire even work. There is only one thing, that is a kind of blind belief, worshipping a kind of maybe people. Unfortunately, majority of the people, they don't have any kind of faith over God, than even they have a kind of faith over only one thing, that is a kind of lust. Most of the priest, or even whatever they mentioned, pandas or maybe some other people, they have a kind of desire over the young people. If someone is young, if someone is old, they are trying to even cheat and get the money. But when it comes to the South Indian temple, somewhere it is completely, I think, maybe different, because there also the priest, they do, I think, they do charge money, they do everything, but there was no such kind of maybe harassment. I found lot of harassment even in this Nilakanta Braja in Brindavan's culture, because no one, when there is a one small incident, when person is about to die, the eagle was ready to eat even that flesh. But no, I think no devotee, even no one never even look at that body, because there, even if someone die also, there is a one proverb even in Telugu. It means people will ready to take even money on dead body. I was thinking that why that kind of proverb it was there, but now I found that there is a kind of realistic information in Brindavan. People, when they want to fight for dead bodies, whatever, if there is any kind of golden teeth or maybe some any kind of maybe property, if it is available in someone's place, they want to look at the person's money or maybe property, not the body. And moreover, I found one another information is that bhakti cult and laziness. Of course, it started somewhere in Jainism and Buddhism. Initially, in maybe the Vedic cults, when they have given a kind of maybe importance to salvation to the only particular community and particular group of people, especially male. Later, the Jainism, Buddhism promoted that all are eligible to get the salvation. There, what happened? The people who had issues in the family, the person who doesn't want to even work in the family, the person who doesn't have comfortable life with even family. So these people all run away from the family and they became a saint. The same, many people, especially the lazy people, they converted into saints and having a kind of comfortable life. Somehow I found same kind of similar information even in Nilakanta Brajas. It means, it seems that that influence somewhere it is reflected even on Vaishnava cult. Many people, they don't want to work, and I have seen somewhere if there is no food, they are ready to sit in front of temples, even on the step. They are ready to even beg, but they don't want to work. I have one small doubt that I think whether Bhakti cult promoted Bhakti culture or they promoted the kind of laziness. Why I'm not focusing on Radhesham, because yesterday so many people, they have already, one speaker already presented and everyone, they have idea. I don't want to again repeat the same information. When we talk about this information, unfortunately that entire story, this novel, it is available, I think it was written in 1986. It means after post-independence, still madam, I think, witnessed this kind of incident. It shows that how many people they had this kind of lifestyle. And moreover, what happened, many people, they have kind of mental disturbance, because in novel, in several places, women, they too have desire. They want to continue life. Even some characters like even Shashi, even other important characters also, they fallen in love with another person, but the system doesn't accept. So somewhere they have a kind of dilemma, whether they want to continue this life or not after widow life, because many people, they were having this kind of confusion. But somehow, why I have found this information, of course, this is my observation in South India, downtrodden community, they never face this kind of problem. Particular group of people, because I'm not using caste or maybe anything, I'm using only one thing, community, because there one can have even more than one marriages, even from female side also. After the death of the husband, even they can even go for another second marriage, third marriage, if they, especially in some kind of downtrodden community, they didn't have these kind of issues. But when it comes to even in the Vrindavan cult, I found that most of the people are from particular community only. Though Bhakti promoted irrespective of caste community, but there the caste system, instead of caste, I can say that Varga or Varna system, it was existing. The so-called great people, even Tagorji, the character, who try to serve even to the people, who never even try to even think about, though he was trying to even keep 2 water glasses, but somehow he failed. It shows that their Bhakti cult, somehow it was there in the name of to spread a kind of information regarding the Bhagavan, but it's not a pure Bhakti. You can say that is a kind of, even in Telugu, we used to say that is called Moda Bhakti, blind belief. And moreover, these people, they misunderstood even Madhura Bhakti also. In South, we have Madhura Bhakti, where Lord Krishna is the only God. Others are God and again male. Others are considered as male. But when it comes to here, they do have the same kind of belief, but they never implemented these kind of rule even in Vrindavan. It was completely a kind of exploitation. Women were exploited. Even Pandas tried to even exploit society. It was entirely according to madams, the Nilakanta's Braja. it was not related to Bhakti cult. Of course, the title itself shows it is completely related to a kind of maybe horrible condition. I can use this word mafia. The Bhakti mafia, I think in the name of Bhakti, how a group of people, they try to even mislead the people, try to even exploit the people. When it comes to the even in the South India, somehow that was there, but luckily or maybe somehow there was a kind of maybe different kind of culture. When it comes to the even widow marriages and everything there, women, they were having a kind of maybe permission to marry even other people, even sometime even priest also. But here they don't have that kind of permission. So what I think it is 20 minutes. Just I'll conclude in 1 minute, Miss Mandavi. So what I want to tell that, if I want to look at Nilakanta Brajas from historical perspective, it is just a kind of not a novel or maybe a kind of creative work. I believe that that is a kind of document to understand Bhakti cult from Jainism, Buddhism, after that again Shaivism, and after that Vaishnavism, the misunderstanding of even the concept of salvation and Mudra Bhakti. One can look at even Bhakti cult in contemporary situation and how people are exploiting, because I have seen the same kind of culture even in South India nowadays, not in human exploitation, but in money exploitation and property exploitation. Because I found that the Baba culture, it was existing even before, even I think from the beginning to till the date, people are highly educated people are, even though the doctor was, the Thakur Sahib was a doctor, he was also again, he was under that kind of maybe, of course, the great saints, they have put Maya in different perspective. I'm in my point of view, Maya means some kind of misunderstanding. So how we misunderstood that concept. So this is my a kind of paper. Of course, I crossed more than one or 2 minutes. I'm sorry. I think if there is any kind of maybe, this is just a kind of my understanding. I never say that it is a kind of maybe paper or maybe research paper. It is a kind of my analytical paper and understanding. If any corrections are there, I'm ready to correct. I'm thankful to one and all, especially to Ratnotama madam. Thank you so much, madam, and thank you, Miss Mandavi.
Thank you so much, sir. It was a very well-detailed presentation, and you've covered a wide range of topics such as bhakti cult, and you've also voiced out the agonies and issues of women. And you've discussed a lot of interesting things and ideas, such as the concept of love. So, a truly inspiring paper, sir. Thank you so much. Now, let me check the chat box for questions. And you have a lot of compliments, sir. And all right. Okay. So I'll just read the compliments out to you. And Shravan Kumar sir says, nice session. And Shankar writes that it's a very interesting observation of harassment, stranglehood of priests in Bhakti culture. Lalita Sharma writes, it's a very interesting approach. And Ratnotma ma'am also thanks you for discussing the novel from a different point of view, where you've compared South Indian Bhakti cult and Vrindavan Bhakti cult. So these are the compliments that we have for you, sir. So if any one of you has any question, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. All right. Okay, so sir, as of now, I don't really see any questions, but in case any one of you has questions, you can drop them in the chat box and then sir will definitely answer them over there. So, okay, we have a question from Ruchi. One second, sir. And she congratulates you and she writes that it's a very nice presentation. Could you talk about the notion of devotion in comparing both?
Actually, I can say that I think maybe I'll take 1 or 2 minutes to talk about this one. If you want to talk about the notion of bhakti, first I think if you understand Narada Bhakti Sutras, Narada Bhakti Sutras, especially there, they promoted Navavida Bhakti Margas. Sravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaranam, Archanam, Vandanam, Dashyam, Sakyam, Atmanivedanam. It means if anyone has any kind of maybe follow this kind of maybe 9 methods, so there is no need to think about all this kind of maybe sacrificing life, even leaving this body and going and getting against salvation. So there they can say that even if you offer namaskara with pure heart, so there automatically you are very close to God. So, but unfortunately, what happened here in South Indian, somehow this cult was promoted and propagated by especially Ramanujacharya's Vishishtadvaitam. They promoted and they propagated, and because of that only, maybe in South Indian, the bhakti culture is somewhere, I think, different to North Indian. But in North India, somewhere, that is completely missing. This the Narada Bhakti Sutras, whatever they mentioned, this Navavida Bhakti Margas, 9 modes of bhakti, that is missing. And it is here only one blind belief is there. If any priest or teacher says something, you have to accept and you should not question. So there you are going to lose even your entire thing. Even when it comes to the, even in Marathi, in Nada Sampradaya is there. In Nada Sampradaya also, there is a one similar kind of bhakti. Their Pancha Makaras are very important. The Pancha Makaras are Madhyam, Maithunam, the fish, Meenam. Again, Mudra. It means I think one can have physical relationship, drinking. Mudra means dance. One can even have food, meat, fish. So there here automatically life is very comfortable. Then where is here devotion? Devotion is that if your mind is completely happy, so automatically that itself is a kind of devotion. Then you are going to focus on devotion. But unfortunately here in Brindavan, everyone, they were struggling for roti. They have mentioned if anyone get 2 rotis, mean that is a kind of great food for them. And everyone, they were struggling even for prasada only. For that prasada, the group of people are moving from one place to another place. There are so many places where they are offering. So here, when you have complete a kind of maybe problem, especially the food problem, shelter problem, how one can focus on even devotion? So if you look at even this Narada Bhakti Sutras and even Nilakanta Braja's information, there is completely misunderstanding of the Bhakti. Bhakti, according to Bhakti of Narada Sutras, simply try to focus, try to have first happy mind. If you are happy mind, then try to even have any kind of, you don't need to go to any temple. Even you try to even remember, you chant even Kirtanam, or maybe chant even, I think maybe Sravanam, whatever, even if you listen, offer Namaskara. That itself is a kind of maybe great devotion to the God. So Bhagavan, I think in even, if you look at even Brahma, first time when Brahma Vaivartita Puranam, Radha Krishna story also, it is available first time in Brahma Vaivartita Puranam only. There, why that Puranam actually try to even implement. So there they have a kind of information that one should have complete family life. Family life means where male, female, they should together and they should have complete happy life. If you are completely happy, then automatically you are going to focus on even God also. But unfortunately, these people are away from everything. In the name of single life, in the name of so many things, they are losing even peace of mind. Of course, I think I spoke more than that because I want to stop somewhere. Sorry. I think I don't know whether I've given right information or not to Miss Ruchi.
Sir, if you could allow me to take up one last question.
Please.
We have a question from Ankita Sethi, and she begins with saying that thank you for such an insightful and informative presentation, sir. Many devotees started feeling like they had individualistic and personal relationship with Lord Krishna. Mirabai considered Lord Krishna to be her lover and husband. So she's just curious to know if such devotion or such example can be found in other parts of the nation as well.
Yeah, we have first one, even Andal also the same example from South Indian, especially Andal or Goda Devi. After that again, the similar kind of even Akkamaha Devi from Shaiva community, Veera Shaivism. She imagined herself that I think Lord Channamallikarjuna, Lord Shiva is the only one, her husband. Goda Devi also even imagined similarly. In Telugu, we have one more devotee, Tarigonda Vengamamba. She mentioned that except Lord Venkateshwara, she doesn't want to marry any human being. So even in North also, we have the similar kind of people, even Mirabai, as you have already said. But we have some kind of information from even Marathi also, Bahina Bhai, Jana Bhai. So we have lot of example, almost we have more than 10 female saints who were actually imagined God as a husband. They never even, they decided they never even look at the any male even face, and even if they look at the male face also, they were treated that they were just looking at female, not a male. I think Ankita Sethi, I don't know whether I have given I think complete answer or not.
So it was a wonderful answer. And thank you so much, sir, once again for being here with us. I have personally benefited a lot from your presentation. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandavi, and thank you to one and all, especially for reader and Ratnotama madam. Thank you.
Okay. So with this, we move on to the last presentation for the session. And we are immensely pleased to have with us Dr. Lutfa Hanum Salima Begum ma'am. And Dr. Salima Begum is a celebrated poet and translator. She has 6 collections of poetry to her credit. And she was also awarded the prestigious Munin Borkotoki Award for Poetry. At present, ma'am is working as the head of the Department of Assamese at Cotton University, Guwahati, Assam. So now I would like to warmly welcome ma'am to enlighten us with her presentation. Ma'am will be speaking on translation as a medium for enchantment of intercultural understanding, case study of Vasudev Das. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. And good morning to everyone. And good wishes to all the members of the Department of MIL and Literary Studies of Delhi University. And I am very much thankful to Dr. Patnaik sir and Dr. Ratnottama Das for inviting me to present a paper in this webinar. So let us read out my paper. My topic is translation as a medium of enhancement of intercultural understanding, a case study of Vasudev Das. The history of translation is very old. The importance and significance of translation has been known since the ancient times, when trade between the different civilizations started at one level of their development and progress. The exchange of different commodities, culture, and tradition started too. In reality, it is impossible to enclose and restrict the culture and literature of a country within its geographical borders. Because of their progressive nature, they spread from one country to another through different mediums. It has also been known that the Western countries have been influenced by the Eastern world since a very long time. It is said that the ancient Greek physician and philosopher Galen, 130 AD to 210 AD, was greatly influenced by Indian knowledge in his medical works. Many ancient Greek philosophical and scientific texts has been translated to the Arabic language as early as the 19th century because of the well-connected and frequently used trade routes that connected the two countries. From there, their treasures of literature has been translated and transported to many other countries of the world. Language plays the most important role in the field of translation. Translation does the work of converting the text of one language to another, but we cannot say that the complete meaning of the main text is expressed by the translated text after translation. The translator translates a text from one language to another only so that people who cannot read or understand the primary language can do so in the language it has been translated. But whether the meaning and essence of all cultural notions and informations are translated accurately from the main text to the translated one is something to question. We are all aware about the concept of language and culture, but the task of translation, we need to take into account two cultural point of views. Because of this, it is very important for the translator to carefully think and evaluate all the cultural information included in the primary text while translating it to the target language. I think there is a necessity to open a window of thought to think about how far it is possible to correctly translate all the cultural materials, context, norms, and informations included in one text to a text of another language. Translation is not simply a work involving only language. We cannot separate language and culture from each other while translating. The main aim of translation is to form a link or a bridge between two languages, cultures, along with two cultural and linguistic societies and environments. The bridge makes it possible to establish international communication and exchanges, overlooking the differences of language, because translation carries the culture of a place outside of its nation or state borders, thus bringing the language and culture of two places closer to each other. It is through translation that people from different states speaking different languages find a way to communicate with each other. We need, we need translation to translate a text from its source language to the target language so that the readers can get a chance to experience and know about the cultures and traditions included in the main text. Because of this huge responsibility upon them, the translator must have a good knowledge both the languages and cultures that the text is involved with. Whether the cultural aspects of a text gets translated or transferred during translation is another thing to question. How can a translator successfully carry forward the cultural aspects and their significance of a text while translating? Because of this, a successful translator can be called an expert of intercultural knowledge, communication, and understanding. That is why it is through the medium of translation the cultural aspects and are transferred from a place to another. And this is how translation plays an important role in the spread of culture. Culture is not a materialistic phenomenon, rather a coming together of the relationship between people, their way of living, their emotions, religious beliefs, etc. The process through which all these aspects that are always carried by people belonging to different walks of life gets merged with their environment and then becomes a part of their life is called culture. This culture is then inherited by the successive generations in the society. Culture can never get transferred on its own, but through people. But when the need to carry culture to a different language arises is when problems related to culture and its proper translation arises. Every country has its own language, culture, traditions, political point of views, beliefs, way of life, etc. Translation is a powerful mode to connect these differences. If the translator does a proper work of translating, the cultural aspect of the source language to the target language, that it creates an environment of mutual understanding between two cultures. When we talk about translation, we usually associate only literary and subjective translation with it. In this particular discussion, we are taking into account only literary translation as its focus area. Basudev Das is mainly translating Assamese text to Bengali. He has been involved with translation since the year 1999. He has already translated and published more than 17 books that includes Assamese short stories, poems, novels, articles, etc. into Bengali, while 7 poetry collections, 6 novels, and 1 book of personal essays are ready and to be published soon. Translated works may not be creative in themselves, but still the readers like to read the translated text in an easily understandable manner. Some things to note about Basudev Das are: he was born in Assam. After completing his higher studies, he began his professional life in the city of Guwahati. He took a voluntary retirement after working for 27 long years in the development bank under the central government. During the multiple conversations that I had with him, he informed me that he took the decision of voluntary retirement so that he could more time to his works in the field of translation. This person devotes more than 12 to 14 hours of his day to translation. Although he has written some books of his own, but compared to that, the count of translated text is much more. His translated works is being published by multiple little magazines in Kolkata. They have also published in books published by some Kolkata reputed publishing houses like Bhasha Sansad and Pratibhasha, etc. The books published by these publishing houses are exported to different countries of the world, including Bangladesh. Das is well aware of the culture related to both the languages, Assamese and Bengali. Does this mean that being bilingual and bicultural makes it easier for a translator to include the intercultural aspects of their works? If the translator has a proper knowledge and understanding of both languages and cultures, when the text translated through literature becomes enjoyable for the reader. The way a translator exposes a language and culture to another through the medium of translation makes it possible for the establishment of a strong intercultural base. Because of the tough times the world is presently going through, we are unable to freely meet each other, talk face to face, keeping aside the digital space, and share our thoughts and feelings. So intercultural communication and exchange is made possible through the translated works. There obviously is the need of a bilingual, multilingual, multicultural translator to appease the modern human beings who are now restricted to live within the borders of their own countries. In the process of translating a text into the target language, the self of the translator to changes somehow, and this self gets reflected in the target language from which it once again come back to the original text. It is not an easy task for a translator to translate a text that consists of not his own, but someone else's emotions, literary works, and culture. To enhance cultural exchanges and build strategic relationships have been an old practice. But the idea of translation is critical and becomes even more fascinating when a person of multicultural background chooses to translate text and literature from either culture or language. The whole act of it comes from a deeper understanding and hence helps in translations that better cater to the cultural exchange. These ideas and the current scenario of the world compels me to ask certain questions that need to be looked at, such as in a world increasingly becoming remote and digital, what is the role of a multilingual translator? Are translators coming from multicultural and multilingual backgrounds better communicators and bridge of the gaps that exist in contemporary translations? What is the role of translators in the world that is trying to bridge cultural understandings while human to human interactions are becoming distant day by day? I would like to conclude with the very famous saying of the great poet Virgil. It is easier to steal the club of Hercules than a line from Homer. Taking into context this very quote, the Assamese author Krishnakanta Handikoi said that it is easier to steal the Gada from Bhima than to steal a line from Kalidasa. I want to end with this quote, as this put us in a space to rethink and try to understand the true role of a translator and the persona of a translator as a factor in the process. I want to think of translation as a process not external to the translator, but rather a very intimate and embodied experience, especially to someone like Mr. Basudev Das. I want to conclude here.
What a beautiful presentation, ma'am. I'm reminded of a quote on translation, that translation is a way of life. Thank you so much for pointing out that translation is not merely restricted to translating language, but how important it is to transmit the culture. So cultural transmission is a very essential part of the process of translation. Thank you for bringing that up. So I'm sure we have a lot of questions for you. Just give me a moment, ma'am. Okay, so we have a question asked by Lakshyajeet. He congratulates you and writes that it was a nice session, and then asks what are the key points that should be kept in mind while translating a piece of literature from one culture to another successfully.
Actually, I didn't include the theoretical part in my presentation. There are some scholars, they discussed about the cultural translation. So I'm unable to explain all the theories here, but especially they discussed about the cultural translation of a text.
So then Ratnotma ma'am writes, thank you for a well-researched paper and introducing such a dedicated translator, Basudev Das, who translates from Assamese to Bengali. And we have a question from Ruchi, who thanks you for the interesting presentation and then asks, could you throw some light on the act of having multicultural exposure for the translator that impact the work of translation itself and therefore include not just mind, but the whole body and being of the translator? Yeah, over to you, ma'am.
I could not understand the point. Actually, he wants to know from me.
Okay, I'll just repeat the question for you. So she wants you to throw some light on the act of having multicultural exposure for the translator that impact the work of translation itself and therefore include not just mind, but the whole body and being of the translator.
Okay, actually, the translation is not just we have a spare time, free time, and we just take up a pen and paper on sheet on our computer and take up translation. It is not like that. In reality, the translator always carries a different kind of self within whom there is a mixed understanding and awareness of place, time, and culture. Uh, Through this self, he can translate a text from a cultural background or cultural context and information to a target language.
Thank you, ma'am. We have another question from Anand, and he asks, what is the relation of Hindi or Assamese bhasha?
Pardon?
So he wants to know what is the relation of Hindi or Assamese bhasha?
Oh, the source of language of Hindi and Assamese is actually not the same, but it is very much nearer to the Bengali. The source of the language, how it develops, Bengali and Assamese is so similar and nearer, but not Hindi actually. The source of language.
Right, ma'am. So I don't think we have any more questions, but we do have compliments for you, ma'am, and you can definitely read them. So once again, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence, ma'am. We were really happy to have you on board with us. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. All right, so with this, we come to the end of the session. And I once again would like to express my gratitude to all of you for being here with us in the webinar. And of course, a huge token of thanks to the speakers for the day. The session has been tremendously inspiring and engaging. And before I conclude, I would like to thank Patnaik sir for giving us the opportunity to keep exploring new ideas. Sir, none of this would have been possible without you. You've always been a constant source of motivation and support. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Ratnotma Das for organizing this wonderful webinar. It has been a thoroughly enjoyable and a learning experience. And ma'am, congratulations on the successful webinar. And of course, I would like to thank Venkat sir. He's been our pillar of strength throughout. So for any kind of assistance, we just knew that we could rely upon you. Thank you so much, sir. And with this, I will sign off, but just a little reminder, we will be meeting back again at 2 p.m. And we request you to join back using this same Zoom link. Thank you so much for being here with us once again. So with this, I take a leave of you. Have a fantastic day ahead. All right.